Wonderful to have all of you here this afternoon on a beautiful day. Thanks for being here in front of your screen to listen to this and what I hope will be a great conversation as opposed to maybe taking your lunch outside. You made the right choice. We're excited to have this panel here. We had a great conversation in our preparation, and I'm really thrilled to have our guests here. All of the folks on this panel are each approaching transit and bus issues from different perspectives, from government and advocacy to policy research. And they very well may find themselves on different sides of arguments and debates at times. But everyone here today shares the same goal, which is to help build a better public transit network and rider experience for all users. Increasingly, buses have been heralded as a great solution to expanding and improving public transportation. So if that's the case, then what we want to explore are what are some of the innovations and new approaches that we need to implement to achieve the greatest form of this vision. Two specific ideas have become hot topics recently, and we really want to focus on those issues with our guests: BRT, bus rapid transit, and fare-free buses. So to start off, little table setting here, talking about buses. Jared, I want to ask you, in your view, what role do buses play in access to public transportation in our region? And just to help us understand and help everyone here be on the same page, who's primarily using bus and area bus networks, and for what purposes?
Yeah. Thanks, Gustavo. It's really exciting to be here. Thanks to Jen and Sean for putting this on, and excited to share the virtual stage with my co-panelists. But the bus network is really the workhorse of the MBTA system. It carries more riders than any of the other modes individually. And the other really interesting thing about it is that the bus's ridership is about 45-ish% minority, and these are pre-COVID statistics, so it's probably even higher now. And about 41% of the riders on the bus network are low income. So again, and those numbers are considerably higher than most of the other modes. And so the bus network really does, is often the only MBTA service in a lot of low income and environmental justice communities. And so it really plays a key role in that. And then I think in COVID, we saw that even more so, that even in the height of the pandemic, the bus ridership really never dropped below 20%. And there were some bus lines, bus routes that really never dropped below 50%, and were right back either approaching their normal ridership or even at it as early as April, May. So we've really seen that the bus is the mode that really connects a lot of essential workers to their jobs, be they restaurant workers, grocery store workers, and our medical professionals for all of the bus lines that serve Longwood Medical and the other hospitals. So again, the bus is really an essential part of the system that's just really shown itself to be a key part of the network, especially during COVID.
Yeah, and I think critical to the point you're making about who has been using the bus throughout COVID, throughout these times when the subway ridership numbers have fallen dramatically, bus ridership has maintained, much more, and it shows that buses are serving communities that otherwise are locked out of access to the subway system that is on the forefront of so many people's minds when they think of the MBTA, right? So I want to use that as a transition to Sarah. In your work at MAPC, you're doing research and you're providing guidance to communities, to municipalities, mayors and city managers throughout Greater Boston. And what you're doing is helping them figure out practically how to implement a better bus network or roadway system that can support better, faster, more efficient bus ridership. Is that right?
Yeah, we try to work with the communities in our region that are struggling to make the most of their roadways and figure out how to, in many cases, reallocate space. So as I was mentioned previously, a lot of times parking is an opportunity to kind of reallocate that space for bus service. A couple of the projects that we've worked on, there's been 60% of people on the roadway are on buses, but they're only given, a fraction of the space and have to share the general lanes with general traffic. So when you start thinking about it and digging into the numbers and having information about who's using the parking, right? Is it residents or is it people coming in from other areas to utilize free on-street parking, which was the case in the Roslindale example? There's lots of different ways to look at it, but communities, especially the smaller ones, don't always have staff capacity to tackle these topics. And that's where we're able to come in and provide some guidance and help make good decision making. But to get to your larger point about bus service, just in the region as a whole, there's a lot of issues with our roadway network. We don't have wide boulevards. We don't have tons of excess capacity. We have constrained roadway space. And so, when we talk about this concept of BRT, I think it's important, first of all, just to define what we're talking about, right? Because
yeah, please do. Actually, that's helpful.
Well, I think everybody has a lot of people have different definitions. The real definition of true BRT, like gold standard BRT, is center lane running, platform level boarding. You board on all doors, you pay before you enter the platform area. That is not what we have here. So a lot of what people reference when they're talking about BRT is not actually BRT. It might be a dedicated lane or some element of BRT, but not the whole shebang. So when we talk about BRT, I think first it's just important to know what we're actually talking about, but also to understand that we don't have the boulevard kind of network that a lot of other cities do that have been able to implement real BRT, and then also the cost of real BRT is something to talk about as well. Those are not cheap projects, and as a region, we need to think about whether we want to go full-scale BRT in a couple areas, or we want to have, good bus improvements in all over the region. And so it's kind of just important to think about all of those different things. But one final point is from MAPC's perspective, we are very interested in the land uses along transit corridors as well, and also providing the opportunity for more housing without a tremendous amount of parking. And that can only happen with real, robust transit service. So we are really focused on improving bus throughout the region because that not only helps the people who want to get where they're going quickly now, which they all deserve to do, but also provides us a lot of opportunity with housing as well.
Kat, I want to bring you into this conversation. I'm gonna throw you a question here that we didn't run through in the prep, but it's a broad one. I think it's just helpful to hear from the MBTA's perspective in the agency that's running these buses. What role do you and does the MBTA see for buses and for specifically for BRT in improving the system and bringing more equitable access to transit in areas of the city, of the region that are not served by the handful of subway lines?
No, thanks, Kevin. I'm glad we're starting with a very narrow question there. But let me start and say thank you also to Jen and Sean for hosting this. Very, very happy. And again, to Jared and Sarah and Gustavo for joining you on this panel. That's a huge question. I'll do my very best to, I think, speak in broad strokes. And I think first and foremost, I think is of the importance of recognizing bus is just as an important mode as any of our other modes, whether it be commuter rail or rapid transit or the ferry or the ride. And I think a lot of phenomenal work that is even enabling us to have this conversation in the past 5 years of both internal and external investments in bus, of just saying how far we've come in the past 5 years, whether it being beginning to move towards zero emissions fleet, beginning to work on updating all of our fleet and facilities. The fact that back in 2015, I think we had the only bus lane. I think Sarah did a great job defining that. When we say BRT, it's really the broad spectrum of transit priority. Really all we had was the Silver Line. And now we have nearly 14 miles, including a pilot on the Tobin Bridge, which is something would be unimaginable 5 years ago. And to say that it's all, I think, more broadly, when we think about bus, our main goals with bus is to make sure that it is frequent, reliable, excessive. And a lot of the work we're going to be doing, and having talked about as well as network redesign, is making sure it's also competitive, that it's providing a viable option to get people where they want to go, whether it's work, travel, leisure, and to make sure that it's there for them when they need it, and that for all those reasons. And so when we think about the role of bus priority, I think, whether it's a side running bus lane that's just some quick red paint, or something far more transformative that also involves like pedestrian refuges, cycling facility, much more similar to think about what we're doing down in Columbus with the city of Boston, is that far more transformative experience to reflect that just the sheer number of riders who are going up and down. I think, so taking a step back.
You're referring to the Columbus Ave between yes. Eggleston Square and Jackson Square, Roxbury and JP in Boston. And a new installation of lanes there. Exactly,
and it's actually the first center running, for those who don't know, it's our first center running bus lane in the greater Boston area, which is just a really exciting concept to see come to fruition, and see how is this going to work in Boston. Because I think when we think about the future of bus, and I think it's important to say that we don't do any of this without collaboration with our municipalities, without the roadway owners, whether they be MassDOT or DCR or the cities, without partnerships with organizations like MAPC, to make sure we're engaging the community, to say is like, we envision, and really have been driving towards this since 2016, that where we have slower buses, or where we have delays, or where honestly the most important thing when we think about operations is reliability and variation, of just making sure that when you show up to the bus, that you're expecting a 10-minute trip, it will always take 10 minutes, and making sure whether it's a Monday at 2 p.m. or a Friday at 6 a.m., that's how long your trip's going to be. Trying to move towards a system of targeting roughly about 7 to 10 lane miles a year from now until I think we've built out the full network.
So you started to get into topics of operations, and I think I'll stay there for a moment and come back to fare-free buses in a short bit. We're in the company and fellowship of transit nerds here, which is wonderful. And so we should get into some of the nitty-gritty issues. Jared, Kat just mentioned a bunch of operational issues. When we've talked about buses in the public discourse, a lot of the conversation has been about, we need new buses, we need electric buses, or we need to, to build these dedicated lanes, center running, elevated platforms, et cetera, all of those things. Pretty significant infrastructure or equipment that needs to be purchased. But there are other considerations in terms of operating the buses and operating a great bus system and network that creates access and equitable access for riders. Kat mentioned a few of those things. What are some of the things that are on your mind, some of the considerations on your mind in this issue?
Yeah, it's one of the main ones is more people, right? The T always needs more bus operators. That's going to be a key part of delivering the headways, or the time between buses that we want to see. And to that same point on headway, a big sort of area that we definitely want to see work on is on headway management. And the T has been doing some great work on this. They've rolled out some new technology that helps their bus dispatchers, or the folks who say, all right, this bus is leaving here, and sort of keep the buses rolling. They've done some great technology.
Can you just, I know there's a lot of folks who are super in this issue on this call right now, but others who are probably coming in from a more policy perspective in other areas. Headway, let's define that real quick.
Yeah, the time between buses.
Great.
Yeah.
Time between, the bus just left and you missed it.
Right.
How much time do you have to wait
exactly.
in the beating sun in July to get to the next bus?
Right. And so, that it can be on some of the less frequent bus routes. It can be 45-ish minutes during rush hour and 90 minutes, in between. Some of the more frequent ones, every 4-ish, 5 minutes, maybe a little bit less. But definitely one of the frustrations that folks have is a concept called bus bunching, and that's where the headway management just gets off. And that's, bus bunching is where you have a bus come, and then even though the headways are supposed to be, the time between buses is supposed to be about 6-ish minutes, a bus comes, 2 minutes afterwards. And so, the issue there is, that first bus, everyone's getting on that. When that bus is really full, then another bus comes behind it, immediately. And then that means that instead of the next bus coming in 6 minutes, it comes more likely in 10 minutes, 12 minutes. And so you have that big gap in between time. And, the infrastructure plays a huge part in that, because, part of the reason why the headway management is tough is because of traffic that the buses are in. So the bus lanes are going to be a key part of that, but it's also just going to be making sure that the T has the resources for enough drivers, including, for situations where you have call outs, or you have other issues where that could lead to drop trips where a bus just doesn't come. And also more staff that can help with dispatching, so that you have that better headway management, so you don't have to worry about the bunching as much. Those are definitely two really, really, really key things, as well as, another really exciting thing that's happened, and, want to definitely see more of this, is the rider information, making, that's one of the key, they did some really interesting work that, this was on the subway, but it applies to buses as well, that when the new countdown clocks started appearing 4 or 5 years ago, people's experience of their wait time decreased, even though there was no actual change. Just simply knowing when that bus is going to come made their experience better. And so, knowing when the next bus is going to come, knowing how crowded it is, all of those things are really, really key. And so, continuing that work, and then making sure that it's accessible for folks who don't have cell phones. So the T has started rolling out Kat, help me out. What are those?
The e-ink signs.
E-ink signs, yes, to allow folks to see when the next bus is coming, if their phone is low, or doesn't have battery or whatever else. So but headway management and dealing with bus bunching are definitely two of the key sort of operational things that maybe aren't as sexy as bus lanes or free bus, but are really critical. And again, a key part of that is making sure that the T has not just the capital resources to build the stuff and to buy the equipment, but also the operational resources to make sure that they have the people power to run those buses and manage it.
Sarah, really quickly, just curious, are there a couple of things that you've seen in your experience, working with communities in getting these lanes rolled out, that it's like operationally, everyone forgets about this thing that is critically important to making it successful? Any quick points there?
Sure. Yeah. I mean, every quarter that we've worked on is so different and so unique. There are, when you're setting up a bus lane, and if you're using cones, which people are kind of moving away from, but if you're using cones, the cones fall over. If you're suddenly using a curbside lane for buses that was previously used for parking, you have to trim the trees back. Like, I mean, there's so many layers to it that you just couldn't even imagine.
You mentioned that yesterday, that there was a community that all of a sudden had a parking lane that a normal passenger vehicle was parking under a tree, but when you're going to take that lane and use it for a bus lane, all of a sudden you've really got to bring an arborist in and trim some branches out to make room for those buses. You wouldn't think about that.
Yeah, it's very complicated, and really every quarter is totally different and has really unique challenges, and that's why it's helpful to have us as a regional partner, because we're able to come in and be like, this is what happened in that other community, let's talk to this person. And everybody's not tackling the same issue for the first time on their own. Mm-hmm. And we have tips and tricks that we've learned from other places, and so it's helpful because it's a lot to ask these DPW staff to totally take on a whole new thing with new equipment, and sometimes you have just the lanes in the morning, sometimes it's all day, sometimes it's pilot, so it's a lot to ask the individual communities, and that's why we and a lot of the advocacy organizations have been there to kind of just do the handholding. And now that there's, you know, a transit team at the T, of course, they are doing the majority of that now. But years ago, pre-transit team, you know, there was much more of a need for that.
So I want to, before we get to fare free, bus network redesign, Kat, you've brought it up. I know it's something you're thinking a lot about and you're eager to talk about. What do you mean when you talk about this this term, bus network redesign, and why is it so important?
That's a great question. So it's and for those who follow transit will know it's a concept that we're seeing in a lot of cities throughout the US. So Miami, New York, Houston have all done or undertaken similar efforts. And the idea is fundamentally coming from the fact that Greater Boston has changed, but our bus network system is still largely based on the streetcar network for the 1920s. And travel patterns have changed. So like when we developed the streetcar network, Longwood Medical Area wasn't what it was. Kendall Square wasn't what it was. The Seaport wasn't what it was. And so when we created our network, it doesn't take into account all these job centers. Again, jobs aren't the only people travel, but that's as an example. So bus network redesign is saying that essentially we could, and we have as part of the Better Bus Project, the first phase, we can do changes to individual routes. We can put in a bus lane to make an individual's experience better on a specific time of day or area. But bus network redesign is saying essentially if we took a blank sheet approach and said, if we thought from all over, where are people, where are they, and where are they trying to get to? And not only our existing riders, but other people traveling in the region. So we were able to, it's actually super interesting. We spent a lot of time, we won't get into all sort of the nitty gritty technical detail of essentially using a lot of location-based data from people's cell phones, and then obviously ensuring too that we're not undersampling or oversampling any populations to say, where do people actually want to go from where they are? And if we were to redraw the network from scratch, what would that look like? And that's also moving towards some concept of not only thinking about how would we change the routes, but also saying, when we talk to our riders, we routinely hear that we want more frequent service, we want more reliable service, and we want less focus on peak-oriented service. And peak-oriented service is, if you think about a traditional 9-to-5 commuter, a lot of our system has historically been set up to really serve the person who's trying to get to work at 8 in the morning and is trying to leave at 5 o'clock, rather than saying, and the pandemic, I think, has been so insightful to just cut through all that and say, no, we have people who, no matter what, will need the bus at 4 in the morning. We have people, no matter what, are getting off their third shift at 9 p.m. or midnight and absolutely need a bus ride across the river. And saying that we're trying to move to actually more frequent service and more all-day service. So you're not fumbling with your schedule card trying to think, is this bus coming every 10 minutes now or every 30 minutes now? And is my bus even operating? And trying to just get it a lot more simpler and a lot easier to use. And the reason we have to do that network level is you can't get there by changing one route at a time. You really have to take that network point of view. So we're at the stages where there's been a lot of work on the back end and a lot of definition of what does success look like? How do you evaluate like a competitive network? How do you evaluate and look at all the data where people are going to and from? And over the next few months, probably starting really this month and in June, we're going to start doing a lot of public outreach and engagement, trying to get input from our riders, from our bus operators, from our municipalities of what doesn't work in our current network. And then we'll be bringing proposed draft maps, I want to say in October, November, of saying, based on that, does this work for you? And then it would probably be a multi-phase implementation starting in 2022, but might take multiple years to implement, because we also want to make sure if we're going to be putting in a new bus route in a crowded area, there's got to be bus priority, because the last thing we want to do is just add to congestion.
It sounds like there's a great opportunity to redraw the map to bring service to, as you mentioned in the beginning of your comment, to employment nodes that weren't really literally on the map or on the radar back when the routes were drawn. But Jared, it also sounds like this is a major opportunity to expand access into communities that have had either little or too little service in the past. How is Transit Matters thinking about this from an equity perspective?
Yeah, I think it's like you said, it's a great opportunity to add access for those EJ communities, and also to connect them to those job centers, right? That
environmental justice communities.
Environmental justice communities. Yep. Thank you. And one of there's been a huge sort of challenge of a lot of employers are wondering, okay, how do we get more Black and brown folks? How do we get more low income folks, more folks who've been locked out of opportunity? How do we get them? How do we increase our employee numbers in those communities? And a key part of that is going to be commutes, right? That if it takes someone well over an hour, and there are 3 or 4 transfers that are not optimized, it doesn't matter how much outreach you do, there doesn't matter how many people of color you've got on the hiring page, that if the commute doesn't work, they're not going to work there. So I think the bus network redesign is a really great sort of opportunity to say, okay, can we, some high level goals, can we have, most folks, within the inner core, within an X minute commute, but can we specifically say, because, it's not, you do have to think about resources on some level, but say, all right, we're going to specifically say these environmental justice communities, it's going to be the really explicit goal of the bus network redesign to make sure that they have an X minute commute to the main job centers and the main nodes. And so I think, it's a great opportunity to do it that way. And, I think Kat is exactly right on the fact that COVID has really shown that we've got to think differently about transit and how we, who we're serving. Because even before COVID, I would get on the train or the bus at, a Saturday at 4 o'clock and be really surprised at the number of folks who were on the train, or get on the bus at 3 o'clock in the afternoon and see, students and folks going to the third shift really crowded in because the peak hadn't started yet. So I think, as we think about the fact that it's not likely, at least in the short term, that folks are going to be going back into the office 5 days a week exactly at 9 and leaving at 5, to really think about a way that the T is going to be able to grow ridership is by being more attractive on those off-peak periods. So I think the bus network redesign is a really neat opportunity to provide more access for environmental justice communities and for folks who don't work a typical job.
So on to fare-free buses, which is something that has been raised increasingly by advocates and elected officials as a way to expand access and expand equity. Kat, the impact on the MBTA, what would it be to go fare-free?
Christian, I'm going to take a second to explain, because it's just sort of the broader conversation, if that's okay. Because I think,
please,
as we talk about fare-free buses, I realize there are folks who may not have been really listening to this conversation. I think there's 2 questions to answer up front before we get into what does fare-free cost. And the one is, how are we trying to improve bus service? So are we trying to make it, there's a lot of research thinking like, is what really going to be effective? Is it to make it more reliable, more frequent, safer, what have you, more accessible, or more affordable? And recognizing that there is some trade-off between what we're trying to do. And then if the goal is to make it more affordable, I think this is where we'd have a conversation. And for those who are curious, the MBTA recently gave a very detailed presentation on this, I want to say on May 10th at the board meeting on sort of some of the options of, we would say that if our goal is to be more affordable, there's probably several options on the table in addition to fare free. And it's really a question of who are we trying to target? So for example, fare free on bus would mean that we make all of bus trips free, but that wouldn't impact anyone who takes rapid transit, anyone who takes commuter rail or ferry. And then also recognizing about 30 to 40% of all of our bus riders also do transfer to rapid transit. So you're really only able to hit those 70% of bus riders. The alternatives would be something that like a means-based fare. So based on your income, if there was a way to identify that and say that anyone on any of our modes could be using somehow an adjusted fare. And then there's other options that are probably more place-based, like saying, hey, we piloted this over the pandemic. If you live in Lynn, we'll give you your fare to get into Boston would be similar if you were closer to Boston. So I think about, when we think about all these options, it's like the fare free on bus is a very mode oriented approach. The means tested fare is a very people-oriented approach. And the third option is something that's far more location-based. And so I think all of these are options. It's really trying to get to what is the problem we're trying to solve here. If we go with the mode-based, which is the fare-free bus, which I think has gotten a lot of press recently, is recognizing that T recently put out estimates, and we want to be somewhat conservative here, or we showed a range of options, but I think we estimated about $100 million annually if we don't increase bus service, and I want to say about 150 if we do. And we could definitely go into the debate, and I'm sure there will be a lot of discussion of what's in those assumptions, how do you get to those assumptions. But at a high level, what's basically we're assuming there, and I think there's some nuance to draw out, is one is anyone who's currently paying on a bus currently with essentially stored value or a bus only pass would essentially, we would have to replace that revenue. And then anyone who basically switches from subway to bus, because it is now, even though it might be a slightly longer trip, it is now free, we would lose that revenue. And then anyone obviously who's currently buying a monthly pass who will switch to and just say, you know, I'll just take the bus. There's the second concern that we would also see. So there's that cost that we would essentially lead into that. And then the second issue is the question of induced demand. If those who know elasticities, right? If we decrease the cost of something, we expect the demand for it to go up. If we decrease the cost of bus, we would expect bus ridership to increase. And for those who were bus riders even before the pandemic, knew that we often, especially during peak hours, had incredibly crowded buses and often even sometimes had to bypass people as it stands. So there's the decision of, would we need to actually increase bus service to be able to carry the additional number of customers, which also then means more buses, which we currently, as we discussed, don't have the capacity in our existing fleets, our existing garages to support, which would also mean additional bus garages in the long term. So that's one of the key components. It's not just the revenue, it's the question of how do we respond to increased demand. And on the other side, folks may not be aware, but the MBTA also operates the RIDE, which is a paratransit division. And the MBTA, sort of two really key things to know is the MBTA, we're based on the Americans with Disability Act. I believe we have an obligation that the cost of a RIDE trip cannot be more than 2 times the cost of essentially a bus fare. So within a certain buffer of all the bus trips, all of our RIDE trips then would also become free. And we are also legally obligated to serve anyone who meets the conditions for the RIDE to serve a trip. So RIDE, we know, is highly also elastic or highly dependent on, highly impacted by prices when we look at how RIDE demand has increased over the past couple of fare increases. So we'd expect that demand to also increase. And obviously we absolutely have to make sure we're providing those trips, which would also mean an increase in capital costs for the fleet size for the RIDE vehicles, as well as it is our most subsidized fare, so we need to cover all that as well. So all that to say, and again, there's a lot there, but it's not.
What you're saying is it's a simple equation to solve.
Yes,
I get it.
Equations.
Okay, thank you.
Simple equation, yeah. But it's about,
No,
about 150 million is our midpoint estimate based on whether or not we would choose or it makes sense to increase the bus capacity as well.
A lot there for sure, and a lot of considerations, moving parts. Sarah, the research you've done, the work that MAPC is doing, what are some of the considerations that you all are thinking about weighing in this debate on fare-free buses?
I'll just say that I could talk about this for the next 17 hours, but I will try to keep it brief. MAPC has not taken a position on fare-free bus at this point. We are knee deep in all of the numbers. It's great that the T is starting to finally talk about this publicly in terms of what they anticipate to be the impacts. It's helpful that we can all kind of sit around the table and dive into those numbers. I think it's important to note that MAPC is 100% supportive of means tested fares, and we hope that those will be in play before the rollout of AFC2. For me personally, the concept of fare-free bus is really just, and the reason why it's the first time I really am interested in diving into policy in my 17 years in transportation, it's really because of the timing in parallel with the rollout of AFC2 and COVID, obviously, right? You know, just thinking about, you know, what if we didn't spend hundreds of millions of dollars on fare equipment for buses? You know, how would bus service be different in the future if we didn't have those fare enforcement officers that are anticipated in a few years? What would post-COVID recovery look like if we had fare-free buses, and we had people mobile and able to move around. So that's kind of really the personal interest level, is just kind of talking about it and just seeing, you know, pre-COVID, now, and post-COVID, and what that looks like with kind of different scenarios. So it's been really interesting. And I think, you know, to speak for MAPC, you know, we work closely with the legislature to make sure the T is funded, and we try to, you know, get them as much funding as they need, and that's hard to do. There's a lot of financial asks for buses right now, which is what Kat was just getting into, and so our major goal is just making sure that we can continue to invest in buses and provide that reliable service that everybody needs.
All right. Thank you all. A fantastic conversation. We could go probably a full 17 hours, Sarah. But we're gonna leave the remaining 15 minutes for questions. I am gonna go ahead and read off 3 questions that came through the chat. And when we're done with those, then folks, if you're interested in asking a question, you can use the little raise hand function in the in Zoom there, that'll be helpful. We'll be able to call on you. And if you are called on, please unmute yourself and then turn your camera on if you're able to. So first off, David Gasson, our esteemed ABL board chair, posed the question: what is the timeline for having the fleet move to electric buses? And have the resources been budgeted to go in this direction? There'll likely be significant resources in federal infrastructure bill for these transitions. I don't know who wants to take this. Kat, probably, if you want to.
That's probably me, and I'll admit that I know enough of this to be dangerous. So please, and I think some people threw this in chat too. Is Scott Hamway, our director of bus modernization, gave a very, very detailed presentation, I want to say at the end of April. And again, for folks, all of our board meetings are recorded and all of the materials are online. And it goes into essentially the timeline to move to a zero emissions fleet, as well as we need to modernize and update all of our facilities to support battery electric buses. I want to, and of course this is all in support of the Commonwealth plan. I want to say it's about a 15 to 20 year time frame. The lifespan of a bus, I think, is about 14 years right now, according to the FTA. And so basically you would go through and retire buses, and we're essentially right now we're testing to figure out what exactly is the right technology for the T. Our capital improvement plan is 5 years. So if we're looking at like a 15 to 20 year plan, it's obviously not all fully funded, but I believe we have at least gone through and said roughly the cost of what it will take to rebuild, replace, expand all of our facilities, and move to a new bus fleet, which I think is, I don't want to give that number because that I don't know off the top of my head, but I believe it is out there.
Great. Pete Wilson posed the question: does the bus network redesign also include considerations of bus lanes on highways or only on city streets? Kat, you can answer that if anyone else has opinions on that.
Yeah, so I would say, especially for when we think about bridges, so a lot of them are owned by MassDOT or DCR, and so for all those, we'll always work with the roadway owner and what makes sense. For more stuff like your 91, 93, those are broader conversations of thinking about and piloting something called bus on shoulder. But absolutely, we're thinking about where do the routes make sense, and then where should we put a bus lane? I think a great example of that, again, on the Tobin Bridge, our friends over at MassDOT are actively piloting a 12-month pilot. So I guess is like the highway absolutely is considered as part of the process. It's just a roadway to us.
A question bridging the past 2 questions from John Stout: does bus network redesign take into account use of electric buses as well as new bus facilities? And I know bus facilities also starts to get into a question of land use questions. But first off, Kat, quickly, does it take into account electric buses?
Yes. So our bus network redesign team and our bus modernization team work very, very closely together, both thinking short-term, long-term. So I think we'll often have conversations of where will does it make sense? The garage is, there's something called deadheading, which is the time it takes where we're not carrying passengers, but you get buses from their garages, their homes, to where they need to start the trip. That burns fuel, that takes time. So trying to minimize that is all part of a broad, complex conversation, like where will that be, and will we have them in the right places to allow us? So yes, they work closely together.
Yeah, and as we get to electric buses, we start to think about the bus facilities have different demands and also different impacts. Sarah, Jared, either of you have thoughts on these facilities?
Opportunities. I mean, I think this is why Transit Matters is really excited about bus electrification, and why we're really dogged on pushing the T to adopt a really aggressive timeline, is because it does open up new opportunities. Obviously, and I've had lots of conversations with the T's vice chair, Monica Tibbetts-Nutt, about that it's sometimes tough to get municipalities to say, we want a big giant bus garage here, and yes, take that tax money off of our rolls, and have the neighbors complain about a loud, sometimes noxious bus garage. But if you've got an electric bus facility, there are new opportunities to look at some innovative things when it comes to land use and some kind of ground lease situation where the municipality doesn't have to give up that tax revenue, or at least all of it, and where you can have neighbors much more closely integrated on top of the facility, wrapping around it, because you don't have some of those same issues with noise and with fumes. Actually, I'll see if I can link it in the chat if I remember, but there was a report about some of these different options that you could do with a bus facility that's 100% electric. So yeah, I think there's really neat opportunities that come when you're talking about 100% electric bus fleet.
So Sarah, a question for you is this is from Rachel Fitchenbaum. Is MAPC looking at fare-free bus from a statewide perspective, or is it strictly an MBTA service area? Now, your MAPC's specific geographic focus kind of overlaps with MBTA service area, is that right?
Yeah, so we're Greater Boston, 101 cities and towns. So we are not overlapping with Worcester and Lawrence, I believe, where they did the fare free. Just quickly, RTAs have a very different fare revenue structure than the MBTA.
Regional transit authorities?
Yes, thank you.
That's like, what's an example of an RTA, just for folks?
There's one in Worcester, Framingham RTA. Okay. So those are kind of more the shuttle buses, smaller service, much less trips than we're talking about with the MBTA. So I think based on research, it actually sounds like for smaller transit organizations, fare free bus might actually make a lot of sense because they spend so much money collecting revenue. That having been said, the RTAs and the statewide conversation is beyond our limits, but we're definitely thinking about it. And based on what I understand, if the MBTA were to go fare free, the RTAs would as well. But I think the RTAs could do it on their own without the MBTA.
I have a question from Laurel Page at Seekins, and I think this is for everyone. We can, folks can jump in as they want, but how do all of your organizations think about how to be accountable to bus riders in your decision making, and what does that look like in practice? It's really, you're all coming from different perspectives. An advocacy organization that really, I think, is kind of has almost membership by folks, municipalities supporting MAPC, and then the T itself. So how do you think about being accountable to bus riders and decision making? Kat, I'll pose it to you.
That's a great question. I had the pleasure to do work with Laurel, and Laurel, thank you for the question. This is probably also something we could talk about 17 hours, because again, the question of who are we serving, how are we serving them, and how do we know we're doing a good job and how to get better? My gut reaction on this, and I'm sorry, Laurel, it's probably not as nuanced as it could be or should be, is the idea of, I would say, one, not assuming in our processes that we know what our riders are thinking, and constantly going back to them and saying, what do you think now? What do you think now? What do you think now? And I think we do that in a lot of ways, both actively and passively, both actively being surveys of other employers, or we have ongoing panels, and then also more passively with seeing where ridership is, where it's changing and how it's responding. And I think important to that too is, and this gets into network redesign, I think some really challenging conversations we're having, and with our external task force, of which both Jared and Sarah have representation on, a thing like how do we know we're actually getting the voice of the rider? Because I think we can have a public meeting, but if 80 people show up or 800 people show up, again, we have nearly 400,000 riders a day, or 450,000 riders a day pre-COVID. How do we know that's actually representative of the people who may not have the time, the access to say that they're really representing them? So I think it's ensuring that we're constantly going back, that we're not assuming, and that we're also constantly asking ourselves, who are we not hearing from, and to making sure that that somehow is brought to the table.
I think I'll just give maybe a very quick, slightly different spin on that. Looking at a lot of the quarters that have had bus improvements over the last 5 years, Everett, Rosendale, Brighton Ave, just thinking off the top of my head, all of those came from long public processes. There was the Everett Transit Action Plan, there was Go Boston 2030, the Boston just a couple weeks ago released one for Brighton, which has another bus lane. Those are long processes where lots of people were talked to, and they said, we want frequency and reliability, right? Like that's what people want. Like, and so when we are part of a project team or asked to assist a community with implementation, and we can point to that and say, you guys did your homework, you did it. People want this, people want improvements. Let's figure out how to get it done. That helps us move, past the, outreach stage, and, using Jay Monty's, the pilot is the process. We're able to just kind of dive in and say, we heard you, we listened to you, and here we're doing something. And with bus, it provides you that opportunity to do it in a much faster timeline than any other type of transit.
That's a great point.
Jared, quick closing thought on this.
Yeah. I think for us, Transit Matters is a unique organization because we're mostly sort of transit geeks. We wouldn't necessarily call ourselves a grassroots organization. Most of our riders live in Cambridge, mostly on the higher income kind of scale of things. But what we do is we work really closely with environmental justice groups, with groups like Green Roots, ACE, and so we use that to help us inform how that we use that to help inform us and help keep us accountable to bus riders. And there are occasions where we do actually, we do the surveying in Everett on some of the bus lanes that were unveiled last fall. We worked hand in hand with the city of Everett to do the surveying, to talk to residents and business owners. So it's a mix, but I think it's really listening to the bus riders and listening to those organizations that are closer on the ground, because we work really kind of across the whole, from Worcester to Wachusett, down to Woonsocket. It's a huge area, and so we can't be a sort of a grassroots group in all of those areas. So we really depend really heavily on partnerships.
All right. Well, that's a great way to end it. I want to thank each of you for your time this afternoon, for your expertise, insight, and leadership on these issues. This is only the beginning of a conversation about the role of buses in transit equity and ensuring everyone in the region has access to convenient and high quality public transportation for wherever they need to get to their job, back home, to medical appointments, or to school, or just to go enjoy themselves and have fun, which we forget sometimes in those lists. ABL has more programming on transit equity coming this year, so be on the lookout for our emails. Go to alliancebl.org for more information about ABL, and joining this group of business leaders and advocates fighting for progressive transportation, energy, environmental, housing, and workplace equity policies. Thank you all so much. Enjoy the rest of this beautiful day.